I'd like to try to approach this evening kind of going through a historic perspective and talking about kind of, if you will, what my journey and our journey as an organization has been in understanding the pieces relative to children within the spectrum. One of the things that's kind of important from the get-go to understand is our perception as an organization is that we are constantly looking to better understand all aspects of all the kids we work with. We're an eclectic organization, meaning we utilize many specific techniques and methodologies and always are looking for better ones. Right? And to help you understand the process, what I want to do is help you understand kind of what the historic process has been with the kids. The story of autism kind of begins in the 40s. And, I don't know how familiar you folks are with what the history is, but Leo Kanner was the first one who kind of coined the term autism. And autism, as it was first identified, essentially meant escaping from reality. Truth is, relative to the perception of escape from reality, a lot of parents and kids with kids in the spectrum would like to be able to escape from the reality. But that was the initial perception. About the same time, a guy named Hans Asperger became involved, and he worked with children who were high functioning, and essentially he coined the term Asperger's syndrome, and essentially that meant autistic people who could speak. Unfortunately, the world relative to its approach and understanding of kids within the spectrum went downhill from there. Because in the 50s, the Freudians got involved in the process and determined that it was a psychiatric problem. And then we had this great guy named Bruno Bettelheim, who was the friend of all mothers, because he said the problem was caused by mothers. Matter of fact, he called them refrigerator mothers. And if you can imagine, today as a mother in particular, how difficult it is, trying to help your child within the spectrum. Imagine back then being blamed for the problem. Okay, when I first got into this work, mothers were in fact blamed for the problem. They were the cause of the problem. So back then it was absolutely horrendous. And the mothers that I saw back, in the early part of my career, were ready to go bonkers because they were trying to deal with the problem. No one understood the problem, then blamed them for the problem. So if you think you're having a bad day, with your child today, imagine what it was like back then. Okay, it was really horrendous. And back in that time, Bruno Bettelheim, by the way, the one who coined that term, it turned out eventually that he had fabricated his credentials. And this guy who did all this harm was doing it illegitimately. So that helps a little bit. My initial introduction was in school in the 60s. And still in the 60s, the problem was perceived as primarily as being a psychiatric problem. And about all that we had going for us back at that time in terms of understanding what to do was behavior mod database kind of programs where we worked at trying to change behaviors and teach skills rather than trying to identify what really was broken and fix it. Sadly, there are an awful lot of kids today that the closest thing they're receiving to treatment is essentially database behavior mod programs and attempts to teach skills. Unfortunately, we've come a long way since then in our understanding of what's going on, and hopefully tonight I'll help you, get a better perspective on that. I started off in 1969 as a special ed teacher, and back at that point, I had a full range of kids that I worked with as a special ed teacher. many of whom were autistic. And working with those kids back then, it became apparent very early on that I wasn't dealing with psychiatric problems. I was dealing with a lot more fundamental problems in terms of how these kids perceived the world and interacted with the world. And they obviously had neurologically based problems. And one of the things that became very, very significant in terms of my life and career with the kids was an associate of my father's, a Dr. Carl Delicato. In about 1970, gave me a manuscript for a book that he had written called The Ultimate Stranger. And Carl was actually the first person to identify the sensory dysfunction that exists in children within the spectrum. And he was quite instrumental in really helping our initial understanding of what was going on. And he essentially identified sensory dysfunction in terms of kids being hyper, hypo, or having what he termed white noise within the system, meaning every sensory channel was distorted in some way. He also had the perception that if we looked at how the children were behaving and seeing the abnormal behaviors they had, we could identify what was broken. And the perception back then was that the kids were trying to treat themselves with their sensory behaviors. We've since discovered that it's not the case, but back then that was pretty insightful. All right, and again, this was about 1970. One of the things that's interesting in the related fields is often the origins of knowledge are not identified. You know, we have many occupational therapists who in recent years have begun to discover that these kids have sensory issues and lump it all kind of under sensory integration. The truth is, this understanding initially came about way back in 1970. All right, and you know, we've been working on really understanding these pieces since way back then. In 1970, we began what we called an autistic unit. And the participants in that were my father, who was a MD physiatrist. I don't know if many of you know what a physiatrist is. A physiatrist is a medical doctor that specializes in rehabilitation. And back at that time, that was the closest thing to a specialty that kind of addressed this type of issue. Another very important member of the team was a Dr. Eugene Spitz. Dr. Spitz was one of the first pediatric neurologists, neurosurgeons on the planet, and was in fact the neurosurgeon who developed the shunt for the hydrocephalic kids. Genius, very, very, very bright guy. And then there was Dr. Delicato, who again wrote the book The Ultimate Stranger. And then I was part of the development team for the autistic unit. My area of expertise back then was kind of behavioral issues and educational issues involved with the kids. But back then we would have these groups of families come in with their autistic children and spend 3 or 4 days with us. And we do this every couple months. And back at that time, that was really an interesting deal because there were not that many kids identified as being autistic. And we would typically have 30 or 40 families come in all at the same time from all over the world and interact with the families and interact with the kids and try to assess the kids and design programs for the kids. It was incredible. I mean, you can imagine what it was like back then, having that many families with their autistic kids in one spot for that many days. It was an adventure, if nothing else. Right? And you know, we were operating from an understanding, yes, these kids have these sensory issues. We were also looking for underlying metabolic issues. And when the kids would come in, we not only would do our developmental assessments and sensory assessments, we would also do a full neurological workup. And these kids, back again, we're talking about 1970, they would get an EEG, they get a CAT scan, and they get metabolic workups. And essentially, we did the whole traditional medical thing to try to identify what was broken. from that standpoint. And kind of what we were seeing back then was not a whole lot that told us much of anything. You know, essentially the EEGs were as disorganized as we would expect them to be based on where we saw the level of function of the kids. The CAT scans generally were negative. That provided us with virtually no information. And in terms of the metabolic function, we kind of saw the full range of issues that we saw in any kids who had brain injuries or significant developmental problems. So again, no particularly great insights came from that work at that time. But the insights mostly came from having the opportunity to spend the time with the kids and develop programs and essentially see what happened. And seeing what happened was interesting because back then nothing was happening with these kids. Nobody had a clue what to do other than, if you will, train them. Right? So these were really, really interesting times. At the same time I was working through the autistic unit, I continued as a special ed teacher, and then in like '73 became clinical director of the United Cerebral Palsy Organization. And we had a school with about 250 kids and a clinic with about another 250 kids who did outpatient programs. And I was able to apply a lot of what we were learning through the autistic unit with these kids I had within my school and within my clinic. And that caseload helped kind of accelerate the process. At that point, you know, we knew we had these sensory issues. We didn't have much of a clue how to fix them. You know, for example, we identified pretty early on, for example, that a lot of the kids were hypersensitive to sound. And our solution to that was we plugged their ears. Okay? Logical thing to do, and in some extreme cases, you know, in places, it helped the kids. But it really didn't fix what was broken. You know, we knew they had visual problems, and we had an ophthalmologist on our team and an optometrist on our team, and we tried different forms of visual therapy to try to address those issues. One of the interesting ahas that occurred at that time was educationally, I was experimenting with different ways to teach the kids and attempting to find out what got their attention. And one of the things I was discovering was the faster I presented information, the better attention I got. So I'd have these kids in the classroom who were autistic, you know, whose eyes were all over the place and couldn't get any attention from them. And if I presented things in any kind of a normal fashion, I got no attention from them. But I discovered if I started presenting things rapidly, I got their attention. And I used to use something called a statistoscope back then, which was an instrument that would flash information at a particular speed. And I could adjust that speed all the way up to 1,000th of a second. And I actually found some kids didn't start to attend until I was presenting the information at 1,000th of a second. Okay. So the faster it went, the better attention I got. The slower I presented it, the less attention I got. So I found that doing things very rapidly, the kids would start tuning in. And I had an understanding back then, and with the optometrists and ophthalmologists we worked with, an understanding that if we could get them to visually tune into the information for an instant, they could process the information. And the faster we did it, the more information we got in. So we actually started educating them and started to get initial insights into what's called macular function, which is the function of the central vision as opposed to peripheral function, which we later learned with what our kids were primarily using, was a peripheral. So at that point we had, you know, this combination of things going on between the autistic unit, then essentially I had my school, which was my lab, if you will, where I could work with the kids and kind of start discovering what was working. Toward the middle 70s, I started with our teams traveling around the world a bit. We started seeing kids in Israel, we started seeing kids in Spain, And actually, in the late 70s, I went to Spain to live for a year to set up some model programs in Spain. And at that point, I was also traveling back to the States every 3 months, and I had clinics going on in LA and San Francisco, and I had one in New Jersey. And part of what happened in that interim is kind of the word was getting out relative to what we were doing and what we were seeing. And I started having parents from around the country calling and traveling to these various centers and then saying, well, gee, we want to have you and people like you coming to where we are, which is why we started NACD and why we're in these chapters around the United States. Because essentially the families requested it and then kind of demanded it, if you will, right? Because we were doing some things that were very different and very significant.